If you know what you're looking at, you're probably asking yourself, why did I make yet another financial mistake and pick up a spare motor, despite me already having one? Well, main reason was cost. The one I have in the car has a blown head gasket or a warped head or something brought to me by a shop when it went in for a completely unrelated purpose. There's coolant leaking from where the head and the block meet, and a machine shop to fix that would cost about $300. I picked this up for half of that, and it has roughly half the mileage of the block I have on there now. We picked it up, and it was pretty sad. The block was rusted everywhere, and just overall unhappy. There was some really crusty crud in the water pump, which, not gonna lie, kind of scared me a bit, but thankfully the cooling jackets were actually okay. This block is going to be my time attack engine for CSCS production class. I wanted to make sure that there were zero leaks or performance issues. My old block was tired, and despite having factory boost levels, was making only 175-ish horsepower. So what I ended up doing is we picked this up, tore it all down, and despite doing what I could, I ended up taking the cylinder head home to work on it, replace the valve seals. So here we are in my home garage. I took the cylinder head home, as I said, and this thing just fought me everywhere. The valve seals were a bit of a pain to get out, and I replaced them with Viton. The reason I went Viton is because it can take higher temperature than the OEM rubber ones, and it just made a lot more sense to want to go that way. The valve spring compressor I was using was less than ideal, but it got the job done. And the only reason I wanted to is, well, I have it apart, everything's readily accessible. So here I am lapping the valves in as well and trying to get the camera to focus on the valve stem and the seat area where it contacts the seat inside the head. The camera just is not wanting to do that. For some reason, the camera never really finishes and focuses on what I need it to at a given time, but hey, you gotta make do with what you got. And I will be sending this head out to the machine shop to ensure the deck is perfectly flat. I don't want to take any chances this time around. I'll spend the money and do it right. I think we're on day 3 now of actual work. Decided today's the day I'm going to spend the time and make the motor look somewhat pretty. So wire wheeled the whole thing down, get any flaking rust off of it, and hit it with some rust converter and engine enamel. Went with the typical gloss black here. Debated sending it out for powder coating, but that's a time and resource I don't have access to, even though I do my own powder coating as well on the side. Just not something that was feasible at the time. The only problem we ran into is getting paint where it shouldn't be, and oh my god, does this paint like to get into places. Even having everything masked and taped off, which you can't see, it's on the other side, it just crept into everywhere. The oil cooler is also completely screwed. As you can see, it's bent the wrong way. I'm not sure if it leaks. I've never had coolant in it to test it, but I'm not taking any chances. It just looks way bent right out of the way, and I'd rather not blow my head gasket again simply by losing all my coolant out of my oil cooler. At this point, I ended up getting the head back from the machine shop and installing the head studs. The machine shop said they only had to take off about a half thousandth to make it flat, which was surprising considering it's 17 years old. Here we are installing the head, and when I asked Ryan here to help me line it up on the studs, I don't think he understood me. Here he is trying to stick his finger in the same hole as the stud, and it just wasn't working. There's probably 50,000 different ways to go about this, like installing the head on the gasket, putting the stud through the head, and going about that way, but this seemed like the greatest idea to me at the time, not realizing that, hey, I could have done it the other way should the situation come to it. The machine shop was also nice enough to include a hot tank service in with their resurfacing, and which made it really nice to see any leftover gasket material. There are many schools of thought when it comes to removing old gaskets. I've seen people use cookies, fire, sandpaper, razor blades, roll-lock disc, and all the sort. My personal rule of thumb is if it's a machine surface, try to keep it as flat as possible to avoid a leak. Ideally, a straight razor blade with some gasket remover will work for 99% of the time, unless you have some major rust issues. You guys get the luxury of watching me install ARP nuts for the first time ever on video. Here I am sitting here trying to lube them, and it's just not going well. Well, the actual lube is working fine, but the problem is, the way this head is designed, there's a lot of things in the way between you and the actual stud that you're trying to thread the nut on. There's a cam journal surface, a bridge thing almost that goes across the length of the head, presumably for structure, and the valve spring assembly. It's next to no working room. I'm sure I could get a socket in there, but I'm personally a fan of using your hands to start it. That way you can feel if there's any dirt or debris on the threads. That would make you have to remove the stud and clean it in order to get the proper torque. The torque spec on these is different than OEM, so consult with ARP for the actual torque spec, because they're the ones that made it and know best. You're probably wondering why I'm using the ARP lube versus motor oil. I know when you're installing head bolts you need to use motor oil, but not all lubes are the same. Some of them are more lubric than others, and what can happen is if you use Moly lube or ARP lube on head bolts, you'll over torque them and you'll stretch them, and then you won't get a good seal. Same applies to if you're using head studs and you use anything but what they recommend. You're not going to get the proper torque sequence because of how lubric the lube actually is. If ARP studs or whatever studs you're using are out of your price range and you have to go OEM head bolt, don't make the mistake I did and use aftermarket head bolt. What ended up happening is the aftermarket head bolt, to save a couple of dollars, ended up catching on a little bit of the casting flash here, and it just didn't work properly. What ended up happening was it caught, and even though the torque wrench was registering the proper torque spec, all it was doing was bending the washer. We didn't realize it right away, but when we went to go do first startup, the gasket didn't torque and we ended up with oil and coolant coming out from where the block and head meet. Basically with the same situation that I'm in now, except a year later and not immediately. This whole scene right here is a perfect lesson on why you want to maintain the tools, and if you have any doubt whether the torque spec of your fasteners or your equipment you're using is not adequate for the fastener you're tightening down, go back and double check your work. It's better to spend an extra 10 minutes doing it now than a day or a weekend going back and having a failed fastener because you're lazy. What ended up happening was this torque wrench was not in spec, and we had to go purchase a new one, or got my other one rather, just so we could finish doing what we're doing. I'm going to go ahead and let Ryan here explain what ended up happening when we were trying to torque the head down. He said it was okay, but I had my doubts. Hoping for
Oh, I found neutral on my...
Oh dear.
on my torque wrench.
That's never good. Now that our cylinder head torque specs are no longer in question, we finally got around to the cams. Around the edge of the cam caps, you want to ensure you use the proper sealant. The factory service manual calls for Mopar gasket maker, which is fancy anaerobic sealant. This stuff is zero clearance sealant meant to go in between two machine surfaces to ensure a proper seal and not mess with the clearance whatsoever. I know it's tempting and a cheaper alternative to use RTV, whatever color of RTV is your fancy for the week, but don't do it. It will not seal and will end up costing you more time when you have to remove the entire cam and the cam gear in order to properly seal this. It's not worth the time. Spend the money and do it now. These cam caps are specifically numbered and machined to the head that they're going into. You can't mix and match cams like you can an ice cream cone. Get it wrong, you're going to damage a cap or, at best, or an entire cam and head. Generally these are marked, but I have seen heads in circumstances where they're not marked and you end up having to guess. Ideally, before you remove them, mark them with some type of permanent marker with some type of marking that will allow you to easily identify them for reinstall in the future. Thankfully, mine is an early style head and has the L and R stampings for left and right intake and exhaust 1 through 6 accordingly. It makes it a lot easier for install. Here I am trying to torque everything back down. You have to, again, there's a torque sequence for this stuff. Do it wrong, you could potentially warp a cam. It's rare, but I have seen it. The smaller 8mm bolts get 105 inch-pounds, or whatever that is in Newton meters. The ones I'm torquing right now get 250 inch-pounds, or also whatever that is in Newton meters. I'm gonna go ahead and let Ryan explain this one while I go pour myself a cup of coffee.
3, 4? Day 4. Whatever. Okay, so everything's all sealed up, as you can see. We've painted some biddies. So yeah, we got the coolant pipe all cleaned up. We got the intake side all cleaned up, but we have a little bit of pitting on the thermostat side, but that's okay because the gasket actually sits inside of that. What Frank is doing right now, if I could move, is putting on the timing cover.
Yep, and then becomes a wonderful task of timing.
Are you gonna write yourself a little note here?
Maybe.
Like how I left my little note
Watch your feet.
right there. What am I stepping on?
Bolts. All my bolts.
Oh Jesus. Anyways, the new water pump is in.
Yep.
With a seated O-ring. Apparently, we use dielectric grease.
Use dielectric grease.
I'm not gonna ask why. But yeah, she is almost ready to drop in. To be honest, I'm just waiting for this coolant pipe to dry, and then I gotta clean the exhaust side and just time it. Right?
Yep.
Right. You can see the anaerobic sealer there. That works pretty well. Anaerobic on that side as well. Yeah, she's looking good. Frank, you feeling good about this motor?
Yeah.
Oh, don't forget, we got to do the oil pan.
Yep.
So we got to take off the oil pan. We got to clean it up. We got to remove all the gasket, replace the gasket, and Frank is actually debating on cutting the tensioner chain,
Balance shaft.
the balance shaft chain.
Ow.
That's what I meant. That is what I meant. So fun fact about these cam gears.
They can be used for multiple motors, 2.4 and 2 liters.
So it all depends on the direction it faces. It uses for both sets of motors, which is pretty cool.
Rubber mallet.
Rubber mallet. Don't mind the mess. We haven't cleaned up since yesterday. Or since we've started. We just said, fuck it. Clunk, 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 clunk. But yeah, there we go. Frank, how's your foot?
It hurts.
What happened yesterday?
That met this, and it was not fun.
What up?
Hey.
Look who it is. It's my cousin. What up?
Hey.
But yeah, so we'll get back to you when we start timing this motor.
Okay, this timing set. Timing one of these motors has got to be the biggest pain for me. I don't know if I just can't do it, but I know other people that can do it first try. Maybe it's an experience thing, who knows, and I'll figure it out eventually. In order to properly time one of these motors, you deliberately have to offset the timing marks, unlike every other motor in existence where you have to line them all three up, the 2 cam gears, and the crank down below. No, the 2 cam gears have to be deliberately offset, not like that, and the crank has to be basically just off on the oil pump housing. You then got to put the belt on around the water pump, either the 2 cam gears, and supposedly the tensioner from being adjusted is supposed to spring the cam gear back into alignment, therefore giving you perfect timing. I've never been able to do it the first time. It usually takes me about 5, 10, or even 20 tries. Last time I had to do this, the motor was in the car, it was in my driveway, and it was stupid o'clock at night and just getting frustrated. Hopefully having everything out of the car will make it for a less stressful time, but as you can see here, I'm failing very much right now. Every time I try to move it, either the belt's not tensioned right, it's off a tooth, or as you can see, the belt just moved the cam gear, therefore bringing everything out of alignment again. Even though it looks close, this motor is not timed, and time to tear it back down and restart, because I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I can't stand timing these things. There is an official cam lock tool you can purchase to make it easier. I gave up after about an hour of the cam gears moving. I'll either buy the cam lock or deal with it when I'm not trying to rush. We ended up focusing the attention on the bottom end, took the oil pan off, cleaned it in the kitchen sink or laundry sink. I opened the balancer assembly and cut the chain as well. The tensioner and the guides were actually rather worn, so it's a good thing I did remove it. Last thing you want is those guides to fail, and what can happen is if that chain fails, unfortunately, it can take out the bottom end. The whole reason it's there is to counteract the NVH of the crank. Larger 4-cylinder motors are more susceptible to NVH than a boxer engine or any other 4-banger. Just how the design is, so they put the balance shafts in there to counteract it. You can remove it, especially if you have solid motor mount. The neglect from the solid motor mount is just going to be less noticeable because you're basically transmitting everything right into the frame of the car. So it's not going to be that much of a deal. If anything, it's not necessarily, well, free horsepower. It'll let the motor rev a bit higher and quicker because it doesn't have a chain literally living under oil trying to spun up by the crank as well. But we'll see if there's actually any merit to this. I'm just going off of information that was given to me over the years on the group page. Sorry everybody, it appears we seem to have lost some footage. What's supposed to be shown here was how to properly time and install the timing components of the motor. However, despite us using 2 phones, multiple days, and multiple attempts, for some reason it just didn't want to record it. Just know that I did it, okay? Just trust me. In the next video, we're going to be taking a look at the actual pulling of the motor and swapping everything out. I don't exactly have a release date on when that video is going to be, but just know that it's in the works. And until next time, we'll see you there.